So today we'll be going and discussing about systematics. By systematics, what it basically means is, if you see a group of organisms, then what you're going to do? The first thing you're going to do is identify them and group them into according to their certain specific characters. After doing that, you're going to give them certain specific names. So basically, when we talk about systematics, what it means is identifying a group of organisms that resemble or have close similarities to each other and then giving them a proper scientific name. Why do we need scientific name? Is because if we use common names, there is many problems. The first thing is, like, let's take into account onion. Like onion in Hindi it is called pyaz. In Tamil it is called vengayam, and in Kannada it is called irudili. So in order to avoid all this, since for the same organism you are having 3 different common names, what we basically follow is scientific names that has been accepted internationally for a single organism. So for plants, the scientific name is determined by International Code for Botanical Nomenclature, whereas for animals it is determined by International Code for Zoological Nomenclature. These 2 organizations are responsible for giving organisms their proper scientific names. So when we talk about scientific names, the most common system followed is binomial nomenclature. By binomial nomenclature, what it means is you're giving 2 names to an organism. Both the names are Latin words. The general rule for scientific name is the first word always starts with a capital letter, whereas the second word starts with a small letter. Another thing you have to keep in mind is the first word represents genus and the second word represents species. So whenever you write scientific name, for example about humans, Homo sapiens, Homo is the first word starting with a capital letter. It belongs to genus. Sapiens is the second Latin word starting with a small letter. It belongs to species. So this is the scientific name for human beings. Now after writing this, generally it is either written in italics, or since we are writing, we underline it. And when you are underlining, the thing to remember is the underline should not be continuous. Each word should be underlined separately. So your binomial nomenclature was given by Linnaeus. He was the scientist who created this method of naming organisms. That means 2 words, first word representing genus, second word representing species. So whenever we talk about scientification, the steps involved are classification, that means grouping organisms in which the organisms share similar characters. After this, what you do is, after grouping the organisms to a particular group, you give them names. That step is called taxonomy. So when classification and taxonomy are followed properly, we also follow the evolutionary history of organisms. That means which organism evolved from one. So whenever we are doing that, this represents systematics. That means grouping organisms having similar characters, giving them a scientific name, and also following the evolutionary history. So such a system is called systematics. So generally when we classify, there are three types of classification. The first one is artificial, the second one is natural, and the third one is phylogenetic classification. So let's talk about artificial classification. By artificial classification, what it means is we're taking an easily observable character. For example, if you want to classify fish, what we're going to take account is their environment. That means fish can either be found in the fresh water or salty environments, that is marine environments or brackish water. So according to this particular category, we have classified fish into three groups. That is, one living in fresh water, one living in marine environment, and the other one is brackish environment. But from this, what happens is the amount of information that we are getting is limited. Probably the most common information we'll be getting is about Osmo Regulation. That is, depending on the environments, how would the fish maintain the osmotic concentrations of the cell. So in artificial classification, we are taking only one easily observable character. Similarly, if you want to classify plants according to artificial character, we can follow this method: herbs, shrubs, and trees. By this, we basically classifying plants according to their heights. These also do not provide many important information. Now the next type of classification is natural. By natural, what it means is we are following various observable characters. And this observable characters, by this what it means is it may either be the external observable characters or the internal observable characters, like your tissue structure or your anatomy. So basically, when we are talking about anatomy, in natural classification, we take into account the homologous organs, not analogous organs. So in order to understand what do you mean by homologous and analogous, what it means is, by homologous what it means is organs having same origin but different function. Example, forelimbs of a bird which serves as flight. But whereas if you compare the forelimbs of a man, it is used to perform various functions. So different functions but same origin. By same origin, what it means is, if you look at the developmental history of the origin of the forelimbs, they have the same bone structure and origin, but they serve different functions. Rather, in birds it has been modified for flight, whereas in humans it has been modified to do various other functions. Analogous means organs with different origins but same function. For example, wings of a bird and wings of insect. They serve the same function, that is flight, but the origins are different because the wings of a bird originated from the forelimbs, whereas the wings of an insect originated from the exoskeleton. So basically, when we are always following natural classification, we take into account the homologous part only, not analogous part. So just think, if you were to take your analogous organs into account, that means according to this mode of system, birds and insects belong to the same category, but it is not so. Insects belong to arthropoda, whereas birds belong to aves. Now, moving on to the third type of classification, it is phylogenetic. By phylogenetic, what it means is we're taking into account the evolutionary history of an organism. So generally, if we talk about life, we all know or generally accept that life originated from a single cell. This cell was prokaryotic, which changed into an eukaryotic cell. This eukaryotic cell became a multicellular organism, giving rise to various groups of organisms that can either be plants, animals, and so on. So by evolutionary history, it means the origin of an animal or plant. So these are basically the different types of classification. So the most common classification of organisms that is widely accepted is the 5 kingdom classification. This classification was given by Whittaker. Why is it most widely accepted? Is because it follows 3 main principles. One is complexity of the cell. By complexity of the cell, what it means is whether the cell is prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Another is complexity of organism. That means whether the the organism is a unicellular or multicellular organism. And the last important criteria is mode of nutrition. That means whether they are autotrophic, that is photosynthetic organisms, or heterotrophic, that means they are following different modes of organism obtaining nutrition. So basically, when we talk about the 5 kingdom classification, we are following these 3 parts: complexity of the cell, complexity of an organism, and the mode of nutrition. So by following these 3 categories, the living organisms of the world has been classified into 5 major kingdoms. Kingdom Monera, Kingdom Protista, Kingdom Fungi, Kingdom Plantae, and Kingdom Animalia. So, according to Whittaker, the 5 kingdoms are Monera, Protista, Fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. Monera and Protista both are unicellular. Fungi is multicellular. Plantae also multicellular. Animalia also multicellular. So the first differences among these are the number of cells. Then next is the type of cell. Monera are prokaryotic, Protista are eukaryotic, eukaryotic. Next is the mode of nutrition among fungi, plantae and animals. Plantae are basically autotrophic. These are heterotrophic. By heterotrophic, generally the mode of nutrition in fungi is they are parasites, but whereas in animals it is we are either herbivores or carnivores or omnivores. Now when we are talking about multicellular in fungi, there is also an exception. If we talk about yeast, it is not a multicellular organism, it is a unicellular organism. So basically these are the different characters of the 5 kingdoms. Now moving on to the next part, we talk about hierarchy. By hierarchy, what it means is we follow a certain rank. So the first rank that is always involved is kingdom. The next one is phylum or division. Then class, order, family, genus and species. As we move lower towards the main category, what happens is the characters from broad become more specific. So generally when we talk about the identification unit, it is always the species, and the broader sense is the kingdom. Kingdom is always the highest class of classification. So let's take into account humans. Humans, we all know, belong to the kingdom Animalia. Then phylum, it belongs to Chordata. Then class Mammalia. Order primates. Family Hominidae. Genus Homo, species Sapiens. Again, following the binomial system of nomenclature, the genus and the species, they have to be underlined. So since humans belong to the Animalia, there are a wide group of animals. So the animals can either be dogs, giraffes or various types. But as we are moving lower down, it becomes more specific. By chordata, what it means is animals whose nerve cord gets converted into a proper vertebral column or vertebral backbone. Again, animals can either be vertebrates and invertebrates. So as we are moving lower down, it becomes more specific. Again, from chordates, we are becoming more specific. That means when we talk about humans, they belong to the class mammals. We can either be different types. So as we move lower down, it becomes more specific. Again, when we talk about primates, it relates to the various types of monkeys, like monkeys, chimpanzees and apes. But as we are moving lower down, it becomes more specific. That it means we belongs to the genus Homo and the species Sapiens. So this is the hierarchical system of classification. Now, in order to study identification better, there are various tools for identification. One of the most common methods is Herbarium. Herbarium is basically used for plants. What they do is they collect plants from this field, identify them, dry them and put it in a piece of paper. Another one is museums. Another one is botanical gardens or zoological parks. All these are the tools used for identification. So this is the entire end of the chapter, and then in the next class we will be moving into more specific kingdoms.